Section 8 of Wellington by George Hooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 6. The Second Rescue of Portugal. The winter of 1808 and 9 was marked by a great calamity, but one which had its compensations. Sir John Moore, who drove into the heart of northern Spain at the head of a small army, was compelled to retreat before the overwhelming numbers and masterful combinations of Napoleon, and died a hero's death at Corunna. Although he was not aided by the Spaniards, he saved the south of Spain for the moment from invasion, and arrested the march of armies upon the weak British and Portuguese force left to guard the town and the harbour of Lisbon. King Joseph re-entered Madrid. The French armies were strongly posted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, from the Bay of Biscay to the Tagus. The fierce spirit of resistance was still unquenched, even by the smoking and exsanguined ruins of Saragossa. Yet before the last British soldier had embarked from Corunna, or Saragossa had capitulated, Napoleon told his brother Jerome that the affairs of Spain were ended. So liable are men of great genius to miscalculation. He remained at Valladolid until January 17th, and then started for Paris to enter on a fresh struggle with Austria, for which he had long been preparing. "What waters do they drink in Vienna?" he ironically asked. "Those of the Danube or the river of Lethe?" And again, "If the Emperor of Austria makes the least movement, he will soon have ceased to reign." The offence of Austria was that she would not be sufficiently submissive. She intrigued with England, as was natural. She raised a considerable army, and was resolved to fight once more, for she was not yet a vassal state. Nor can it be doubted that Napoleon resented symptoms of independence which seemed likely to embarrass his projects in Spain as well as in Germany. "In a few months," he wrote to the Saxon king in February, "the matter will be decided, either by the disarming of Austria and the re-establishment of her army on a peace footing, or by war, which will be followed by the ruin of this grand and ancient monarchy." England would not make peace, he insisted, so long as she had the means of troubling the Continent, and the Continent will not be tranquil so long as Austria is in opposition to us. In this spirit he plunged into a carefully prepared war with Austria. His drafts of soldiers from Spain lessened the stress upon the Peninsula, and he quitted that country never to return, although he retained a villa at Madrid for his use should he again cross the Pyrenees. He set out from Paris on April 14th, and on that day Sir Arthur Wellesley, driven back to Portsmouth by a tempest in the Channel, was waiting a fair wind to sail for Lisbon. Sir John Moore's campaign and its result perplexed the government, gave arms to the opposition, which they freely used, and sobered the enthusiasm, but did not shake the resolution of the British people. If the ministers, burdened by an enormous task, appeared to shrink from the contest in the Peninsula, their better judgment soon regained its ascendancy, and perhaps it was Lord Castlereagh's confidence in Wellesley that produced this fortunate effect. Maturely reflecting on the facts, Sir Arthur drew up a memorandum in which he firmly maintained that whatever might be the issue of the conflict between Napoleon and the Spanish people, Portugal at least could be defended, and Portuguese troops raised and disciplined until they could face the French. He stood alone, or almost alone, in looking on Lisbon as the best base of operations, while others preferred the apparent but delusive advantages of Cadiz and Gibraltar, and his opinions were so clearly and cogently expounded that the Cabinet yielded in the end, and he was appointed to command the army, if on arriving at Lisbon he thought it expedient to do so. The post was then held by Sir John Cradock, and if he were found to be successfully engaged in the field, Sir Arthur said he could not reconcile it to his feelings to supersede him and send him to Gibraltar as governor. He sailed on the 16th, landed at Lisbon on the 22nd, and, as no fresh incident had happened, he relieved Sir John and practically assumed command on April 24th, 1809. Then he began that series of operations which not only defended Portugal, but carried his flag from the Rock of Lisbon to the walls of Toulouse. The spirit of the nation rose at once when he appeared in the streets of Lisbon, and added tenfold to the moral force exerted on the side of the Allies. Sir John Cradock had maintained himself courageously with very small means when he was for weeks left without instructions of any kind, and he took the prudent resolution of securing a feasible retreat by preparing a place of embarkation. The defeat of Moore, an advance of Soult to Oporto, the presence of Victor on the Tagus, and the apathy of the Portuguese were so many dangers which he confronted with manly constancy. As time went on, there were some alleviations. More troops trickled in from England. The Portuguese Regency offered the command of their army to a British officer. They wished to have Wellesley, but he declined the post, and it fell to Beresford, who had a talent for organization. Finally, the French neither advanced across the Tagus within the borders of Portugal, nor pushed on from the Douro to Lisbon. But no one would set the military capacity of Cradock in rivalry with that of Wellesley, and the government, so fiercely assailed, deserves at least the credit of selecting him. Soon after he landed, the Portuguese named him Marshal General, which gave him a solid hold upon the troops and resources of the country, so strong was their confidence, a confidence which in a few weeks he justified abundantly. It was 5 days after landing that he publicly notified his assumption of command, and on May 2nd he was in the field at the head of 25,000 men, 9,000 of whom were Portuguese, and 30 guns. His first step was to organize his commissariat and assure the people that all provisions, supplies, and means of transport would be paid for. His next, to decide on the line of operations. There were 2 enemies before him: Soult at Oporto, well within reach, and Victor remote, yet more dangerous in appearance because he had a road to Lisbon, if he dared to follow it, and the means, if he thought fit to use them. But Victor was far up the Tagus valley. To fight him, concert with the quarrelsome Spanish chief Cuesta was needed, which would take time, while Soult lay close by, held rich provinces and a great city. He was cut off from Victor by the mountains and the partisans, and if the abler Marshal could be defeated swiftly, the other could be dealt with later. Wellesley therefore determined to organize a line of defence upon the right bank of the Tagus, sufficient to delay Victor if he came on, and with the main body to strike boldly at Oporto. There were other reasons for attacking Soult, for a French officer visited the camp and revealed the fact that he and several comrades wished to depose the Marshal, who, having taken on himself the title of Governor-General of Portugal, was called by the soldiers in derision Nicholas I. In that military conspiracy really directed against Napoleon, there was not much depth, but it indicated a loosening of the bonds of discipline and a species of disloyalty very discreditable to soldiers. Wellesley refused point blank to regulate his operations by any such contrivances, and the officer returned across the Douro, where, his machinations being discovered, he was arrested but escaped. At his last visit to the British headquarters, Napier tells us, the traitor, by the orders of Sir Arthur, was conducted through bypaths so that he saw little, and thus, when questioned by Soult, he led him to believe that the hostile army could not move for several days. All this told against Soult. He did not know that an army was close upon him at a moment when the disposition of his own troops favoured an attack. His main body was at Oporto and on the Tomago, separated by the Douro from the infantry and horsemen under Mermet and Franceschi, who were posted between the Douro and the Vuga. Wellesley had his army at Coimbra on the Mondego, and his plan was to hold the French left in check with the Portuguese, supported by a British detachment under Beresford, and to surprise, if possible, and overwhelm the right, whose only line of retreat lay by the boat bridge at Oporto. Beresford therefore marched east of the Sierra in which the Vuga rises, and Wellesley on the 7th, with 16,000 men, moved along the high road between the sea and the hills, reaching the river on the 9th, the troops having halted one day to give Beresford time to arrive on the upper Douro. Franceschi at Albergaria Nova had no notion that an army was within a few miles of his camp, and the object was to surprise him. To effect this, Hill was sent in boats from Avairu to Ovar, at the head of an inlet of the sea. Paget and Sherbrooke marched by a bridge over the Vuga, while Trant, commanding a Portuguese party, was pushed out to turn the French right, and Cotton, with the British horse, was directed on the left. Accidents thwarted the plan, Trant coming on an impassable ravine, and Cotton being misled by guides, so that on one flank Franceschi was not turned, and on the other Cotton came full on his horse and foot by day, and had to halt. Even then the brilliant Italian did not know how large a force was near, but soon Wellesley came up and drove off the infantry, yet could not reach the horse, which adroitly withdrew at dark to Grihon. Here the French fought on the 11th for their line of retreat, but not long, as their position was easily turned. Yet again they escaped the grasp of the assailant, and moving all day got safely over the Douro, for once more orders miscarried and accidents occurred, so that the project of smashing the French right south of the Douro failed of its effect. Nevertheless, the surprise of Soult was complete, and he seems to have trusted to the unfordable Douro for such brief protection as would give him time to slip away. His intention was to retreat by Amarante into the Salamanca country, towards which he sent his heavy impedimenta, and he did not know that Beresford had driven Loison over the Tamega, and that his general, so hated by the Portuguese, had fallen back to Guimarães, leaving the allies in possession of the river passage. So he determined to defend the Douro, and not to march until the 13th. The wished-for delay was not granted to him by his adversary. Bringing the army up to the river early on the 12th, Wellesley eagerly sought the means of crossing. Opposite Oporto the stream flows round a high bluff, the Serra, which overhangs it like a bastion and bears or bore a convent. Under this, on the eastern face, the troops were collected, hidden by the mass from the city. From the summit Wellesley gazed on the deep broad river and the further bank, meditating how to secure the transit for his ardent and hardy soldiers. He quickly observed an isolated building in an enclosure on the opposite shore, having walls on 3 sides, open to the river on the 4th, and accessible from the city by one gate only. Could boats be obtained, Soult had drawn them all to the right bank, the troops sheltered by the bluff would be able, for a time at least, to pass unseen. Wellesley therefore sent General John Murray with the Germans up the river to Avintas to cross there, and planting a battery on the bluff sought for boats. By the aid of a Portuguese colonel, Waters found them. 3 barges were got from the other side, and when he knew that Murray had also obtained some craft, Wellesley gave the signal for the troops to cross. That work was deftly done, and solid possession of the enclosure obtained before the French detected the movement. Then they dashed up, opened a heavy fire, and wounded General Paget, whose place was taken by Hill, but could make no impression in front, nor try the flanks, because Wellesley's guns swept the approaches. For some time 3 battalions stood alone beyond the river and sustained the furious assault. At last Murray was seen moving down the right bank. The townsfolk sent over boats to Sherbrooke's men at a point below the bluff. The uproar in the city indicated a retreat. The French were visibly marching toward Valanga under a heavy fire, and Sherbrooke at length over the river issued from the city and pressed on the rear. Murray did not attack or even fire as he should have done on the retiring columns, who were only molested by 2 squadrons of the 14th Light Dragoons, led by Brigadier Charles Stewart and Major Harvey. The passage of the Douro, a brilliant action in the face of an enemy, cost the British 20 killed and 96 wounded. The French lost 500 killed and wounded and 5 guns, besides 50 without carriages found in the arsenal. Too much is often expected, not only from a general but from his soldiers, whom exacting censors should remember are also human beings. Wellesley halted one day at Oporto, not only because he had to bring his baggage and stores over a wide stream, but because his men had marched 80 miles in 4 days. On the 14th he started for Braga, where he hoped to intercept Soult, who he heard had destroyed his guns and ammunition and crossed the hills towards Braga. That was true, but not all the truth. Finding to his dismay that Loison had abandoned Amarante, Soult on the 13th got rid of every encumbrance, and taking a mountain pathway up the course of a torrent by his quenchless energy, urged the wearied troops over the Sierra to Guimarães, where he had the good fortune to assemble the whole of his army. Then he destroyed the guns belonging to Loison and Lorges, and turning to the right once more plunged into the hills. He made for Montalegre on the road to Orense, outstripping pursuit, securing by daring efforts possession of 2 narrow bridges over the torrents in his way, crossing Montalegre on the 17th, 2 days after filing over the frontier near Alariz, and the next entering Orense. Wellesley had failed to overtake any part of his fugitive force except a rear guard, and neither Beresford nor the Portuguese partisans had been able to cut him off. He owed his escape entirely to himself. He made his exit from Portugal without a gun, but he escaped a fate which at one moment seemed inevitable, capitulation in the open field. If his renown was not diminished, how much that of his opponent was increased. Sir Arthur landed at Lisbon on April 22nd, he began his forward march on May 7th, and 12 days afterwards, so resolute as well as swift were his movements, not a single French soldier remained on the soil of Portugal. Moreover, Soult had been driven into Galicia, and was separated by a wide interval from Victor, whose threatening position in the Tagus valley ceased to be an immediate danger. He was now the object of attack. In the midst of the operations against Soult, the Duke of Belluno had made a show of passing the Tagus at Aliantara, which led to the destruction of the bridge, set General Mackenzie in motion from Abrantes, and made Wellesley, when the intelligence reached him, turn a part of his army southward. But Victor, hearing of Soult's defeat, at once filed over the boat bridge at Almaraz, and took post at Plasencia on the Alagon, covering the road to Madrid, so that by the time Wellesley's army had marched to Abrantes, the French in the Tagus valley were reduced to the defensive. There had been a brief period before Victor's retreat, when it seemed possible to strike him between the Guadiana and the Tagus, but Cuesta, as usual, was intractable. Nothing could be done, and Victor got away. So Arthur was about to have his first experience of Spanish temper and Spanish bad faith. Toward the end of June, the various armies which exerted an influence upon the immediate field of action were spread over a wide extent of territory. 3 French corps in the north, the 2nd, 5th, and 6th, commanded by Laborde, Mortier, and Ney, had just been placed by Napoleon under the command of Soult as the senior officer, with orders to act together, only together, and not in fractions. They were to advance on the English, pursue them without cessation, beat them, and fling them into the sea. Writing on June 11th from Schönbrunn, he said to his generals, "The English alone are redoubtable. They alone, if the army is not differently managed before the lapse of a few months, they will bring upon it a catastrophe." Unfortunately, Ney and Soult were bitter enemies, and it was difficult to effect a hearty cooperation. Soult, having designs against Ciudad Rodrigo, moved on Zamora, calling up Mortier, and Ney, feeling that he was deserted, abandoned Galicia altogether and went to Astorga, reaching that town at the end of June. 2 days later, Soult entered Zamora. The point to notice is that these corps, more than 50,000 strong, were separated from the Tagus valley only by the mountains of Bahar. About the same time, King Joseph and Jourdan, his adviser, were in Madrid. Sebastiani was watching the Spanish general Venegas, who lurked in the Sierra Morena. Victor was at Plasencia, facing Cuesta, who had come from the Guadiana to the Tagus, and Wellesley was at Abrantes, striving to gain the assent of Cuesta to some reasonable plan. At length it was agreed that these two should effect a junction on the right bank, and that to aid this movement Venegas should advance across the upper Tagus and threaten Madrid. It was on June 27th, 1809, that the British army, about 21,000 men and 30 guns, marched from Abrantes in 2 columns upon Castelo Branco, where they merged in one, and headed for Plasencia, which was reached on July 10th. That very day Wellesley went to Mirabete and had a long conference with Cuesta, which ended in some sort of agreement. The British commander was alive, yet not sufficiently alive to the danger which threatened from the side of Bahar, and sent Beresford to Perales. Cuesta grudgingly undertook to watch the pass of Banos, but only sent thither an inadequate force. Wellesley at this time, and even later, underrated the power which Soult might bring to bear, not knowing that he had so far recovered from his beating, and that he had 3 corps under his orders. He therefore persevered in the offensive, trusting overmuch to the Spaniards, whose troops, it turned out, would not stand fire, and whose junta fulfilled none of its promises to furnish transport and supplies. The advance from Abrantes, the approach of Cuesta to the Tagus at Almaraz, and the presence of Sir Robert Wilson's partisan corps near Madrid had induced Victor to retire, first to Talavera, and then behind the Alberche, where he was on June 28th, so that the junction of the British and Spanish armies was effected without molestation of any kind. Wellesley was at Oropesa on July 20th, and Cuesta in his front at Ballara. But here new perils arose. The Spaniards who undertook to furnish food and transport had provided neither, and the army was already on half rations. The consequence was that Sir Arthur declared that he would not pass the Alberche, a threat he had to reiterate later, unless promises were redeemed and his wants were supplied. The threat produced no effect, and the safety of the allied army depended upon fasting troops. Victor had now so posted his men that he covered the line of retreat upon Madrid through Toledo, which could not be assailed, and awaited the movements of the allies with the more confidence because he learned their plans from his spies on Cuesta's staff. Rarely has any general been in a more embarrassing position than Sir Arthur at this moment, for when the fairest chances of overthrowing the French were presented, the Spaniards sulked, and when they were few or none, he was eager to fall on. Wellesley, for example, as early as July 22nd, rode over the river, and from the southern heights took a survey of the French position. He saw that it was pregnable and devised a plan, but Cuesta took to his bed, and the great opportunity was lost. Then, when Victor shifted his divisions a little to the rear, Cuesta followed on the 24th, but the French had gone out of reach. 2 days later he got within their grasp, for he moved recklessly on, and when they turned upon him on the 26th beyond the Alberche, he would have been cut to pieces at Alcabon, had not Wellesley placed 2 divisions and some cavalry on the left of that stream, the sight of whom stopped the French. This offensive stroke, though not pushed home, implied that the enemy had recovered confidence. The reason was that Joseph, providing for the defence of Madrid and summoning Sebastiani from La Mancha, had marched out to join Victor, and did so on the 25th behind the Guadarrama. He had also, through General Foy, given Soult the permission he sought to advance by the pass of Banos upon Plasencia and lead thither all his corps. The peril which beset Wellesley will now be understood. He was far into Spain, acting beside, it can hardly be said in concert with, a most ill-conditioned and dangerous ally. In his front, everything that could be spared from Madrid had been thrust into the valley, a result rendered possible by the treachery of the junta, which, jealous of Cuesta, had ordered Venegas not to push for the capital. On his left rear, but still north of the hills, unknown to him, were 3 French corps, pointing to roads which cut in on his line of retreat as well as his flank. And his army was half starved by the rulers of the people he was there to aid. It was with the greatest difficulty that Cuesta, fresh from his risk at Alcabon, could be induced to cross the Alberche and take post at Talavera, nor was he persuaded until, he said, he made the proud Englishman go down on his knees. Wellesley then, leaving a strong guard on the Alberche, made ready to fight a battle at Talavera. He had nominally 54,000 men and 100 guns, but only 19,000 trusty soldiers, his British and Germans. The French came on with some 50,000 veterans and 80 guns. Wellesley placed the Spaniards on the right in the partially fortified town of Talavera, which was close to the river, and his own brigades on the hills extending northward and ending in a loftier eminence overhanging a narrow valley, beyond which were the mountains. The troops from right to left were Campbell's, Sherbrooke's, and the German Legion, with Donkin's brigade on the bluff which was the key of the position, Hill and the horse in the rear. Early on the morning of the 27th, Mackenzie was still at the front when the French broke over the stream. They surprised the British outposts, bearing down with such speed that Sir Arthur was nearly captured. He rode up from Talavera at the first news, says Sir Samford Whittingham. We advanced into the midst of our skirmishers. The fire was hot and the enemy rapidly approaching. Sir Arthur leaped off his horse and scrambled up the wall of an old ruin close at hand, but he was obliged to throw himself down on his hands and knees and remount instantly, for the enemy's sharpshooters had nearly surrounded the building, and a minute's delay would have constituted him a prisoner. The French were checked by the 45th, a stubborn old regiment, some companies of the 60th, and the personal efforts of the commander. They lost some hundreds in the confusion, but retreated nevertheless through the cork trees and olives to the position where Mackenzie halted behind the centre. This inauspicious beginning was followed by a stroke from Victor which almost ruined his adversary. While a feint by the French horse on the town side sent the Spaniards flying by thousands, and the peril was only averted by Sir Arthur, who brought up some English horse, and those Spaniards who did not run. Victor appeared on the allied left and opened fire from his guns. He saw that the great hill was imperfectly occupied, and being familiar with the ground, he knew the value of that post and tried to surprise and overwhelm its defenders. Just as the twilight was at hand, he ordered Ruffin with a whole division to storm in upon Donkin's brigade. For a moment the chance was in favour of the French. They crowned the hill, steep as it was, for their numbers enabled them to turn the British brigade, but just as they were exulting in success, General Hill brought up the 29th Foot, which charged home, and the intruders were roughly expelled. The 48th and a scratch battalion followed, and were in time to break the force and finally rout a second French attack, made in the growing darkness with a larger force and pushed with great resolution. The left centre, German Legion, had also been assailed, and although the French were worsted, indeed lost 1,000 men, they had tested the weakness as well as the strength of the line and were prepared for the trials of the morrow. It is a peculiarity of the conflict near Talavera that it was divided into several acts. The severe combat in the gloaming of the 27th was renewed at daybreak. Ruffin, supported by Villatte, once more dashed forward, this time on a broad front which turned the shoulder of the hill. His march was covered by artillery fire, and his hardy men went on determined to win, but they were met with greater resolution by the soldiers of Donkin and Hill, who did not run when turned, and who finally prevailed, forcing their adversaries down the steeps with a loss of 1,500 men. Then the guns from the opposite hills renewed their tearing cannonade, and the wearied and shattered assailants regained their former lines. The desperate attack showed Wellesley that he must farther strengthen his left, which he did by placing Bascour's Spanish cavalry, begged from Cuesta beyond, and a body of horse, British and German, facing the valley. They were soon after joined by Albuquerque, who hated his own stupid commander. Now ensued a pause. The soldiers of both armies gathered on the banks of the rivulet in the ravine to drink, while the French generals held a council, when Jourdan urged the king to retire behind the Alberche and wait for Soult, who was coming south from Salamanca. He was to have been at Plasencia on the 31st, but during the high debate a letter from Soult showed that he could not be there until the 2nd or even the 5th of August. News also came in that Venegas had at length marched and had approached Toledo, and swayed by the fear of an attack on Madrid and Victor's eagerness to fight, the king rejected the prudent advice of Jourdan and allowed the battle to be renewed. At this time Wellesley, seated on the lofty hill, received through Donkin a message from Albuquerque to the effect that Cuesta was a traitor. He was intently watching the motions of his adversaries, and, says Napier, he listened to this somewhat startling message without so much as turning his head, and then dryly answering, "Very well, you may return to your brigade," continued his survey of the French. In after years Wellington did not remember the incident, and Lord Stanhope says he evidently did not believe a story which, if not vrai, is certainly vraisemblable. The stress of the battle was yet to come. It was resumed after midday and continued with great violence for more than 5 hours. Victor's plan was to turn the left and break in the centre. He directed Ruffin to turn the left by the valley, while half Vilette's division went against the Key Hill, and Sebastiani's men fell on the troops between its summit and the Spaniards about Talavera. This latter body, preceded by a terrible fire from the French guns, dashed upon Campbell's division and fared ill, for their fierce onset was met by a fiercer counterstroke, in which Mackenzie and some Spaniards joined, and the French were not only routed, but 10 guns were captured, while an attempt to rally in the olive groves and charge again was quickly frustrated. Nor did better fortune befall the French right attack, for, seeing the troops coming on, Wellesley sent against them Anson's cavalry. The German hussars were stopped by a deep chasm, but the 23rd Light Dragoons came upon an easier passage, and, headed by John Ely and Frederick Ponsonby, rode through Vilatte's columns, charged Stolz's French horse brigade beyond the astonished infantry, and were only beaten when, exhausted, they in turn were charged by Polish lancers and German troopers drawn by Victor from the reserve. The heroic 23rd lost Colonel Seymour and more than 200 men, and the survivors found shelter with Bascour Spaniards, but the audacious charge of the regiment was so impressive that it actually arrested the turning movement of Ruffin up the valley. The great hill was untouched, and thence Wellesley watched the eddying fight. For the centre was again ravaged by cannon and assailed by infantry. The storm this time fell on the Germans and the Guards. They threw it back, but the Guards, pursuing hotly, were struck in front and flank, and the French reserves pressing on, the whole fell into confusion. Wellesley, who saw the error of the pursuit, sent down from his eyrie the 48th Foot under Colonel Donellan and Cotton's cavalry, as he says, without orders, moved up. They arrived just in time, for the centre was broken. Donellan led his infantry into the tumultuous throng, which, says Napier, seemed sufficient to carry it away bodily, but wheeling back by companies, that regiment let the crowds pass through, and then, resuming its proud and beautiful line, fell on the flank of the victorious French column, plying them with such a destructive musketry, and closing up on them with such a firm and regular step, that their offensive movement was checked. The broken troops reformed. Cotton's light cavalry, 2 squadrons only, charged. The guns did their work, and the centre was once more solid and impenetrable. No fresh attempt was made by the French, who, worsted at all points, drew off under the protection of their batteries and light troops. The sanguinary battle was won. The British loss in the several actions was more than 6,000, and that of the French 2 generals and upwards of 7,000. 2 British generals, Langworth and Mackenzie, were killed and 3 were wounded. 10 guns were captured in the fight, and 7 more were found in the woods the next day, when Victor retired over the Alberche. Talavera must rank with the great actions recorded in British annals, because, compared with their assailants, the real defenders of the position were so few, and made good the deficiency by freely sacrificing their lives. It is an example of tenacity. The only misfortune of the day arose when the valour of the Guards got the better of their discretion, but it was a general's as well as a soldier's battle, for the watchful commander was the soul of the fight. Some have pretended that after all it was a French victory. Napoleon, if his testimony be needed, may be allowed to decide that question. Writing from Schönbrunn, August 25th, he says, "Tell the King that I see with pain how he calls his soldiers conquerors, and that the fact is, I have lost the battle of Talavera." Publicly he held another language, but privately he spoke the truth. Foiled on the field, and fearing that Venegas on one side and Wilson on the other might reach Madrid, King Joseph marched away on the 29th to save the capital. Victor remained in the valley, alert and ready to retire at the first sign of danger, and a fine reinforcement reached the British army. General Robert Crawford, leading the 52nd, the 43rd, and the 95th, the nucleus of the coming Light Division, passed over the battlefield and took outpost duty, having marched in a July heat 62 miles in 26 hours. One peril had been averted, another was close at hand. On the very day of the battle, Soult began his advance upon Plasencia, and as the Spaniards fled from Banos without firing a shot, the leading columns of the 5th Corps entered the town on the 31st. Wellesley heard of Soult's march on the day before, and a little later that he was in the valley. Leaving Cuesta in Talavera to protect and send away the wounded, he set out himself with his own army to combat the French Marshal, not knowing even then that 3 corps were moving through the hills. Cuesta was better informed, but concealed his knowledge, and it was only when the British chief reached Oropesa on August 3rd that he discovered how great was the risk he ran. For he acquired the knowledge that 50,000 Frenchmen were pressing forward, that Soult's dragoons were over the Titar, not far from the bridge at Almaraz, and that Cuesta had determined to quit Talavera at once and abandon the hospitals full of sick and wounded. The crisis was sharp, but Sir Arthur, cool and quiet, took an instant decision. The Don now wanted to fight at Oropesa, which must have been ruinous, especially as his army was not strong in battle, and as he would not stir. At daybreak on the 4th, the British army alone filed over the bridge at Arzobispo and gained the Col de Mirabete, which ensured a line of retreat to Badajoz. Crawford's active light brigade at the same time passed the rugged hills on the left bank and stood on the 5th, masters of the bridge of Almaraz, rapid movements which foiled Soult and made all secure. Cuesta also managed to pass the river, yet had a narrow escape, and 2 days afterwards his post on the Tagus was surprised and his army in flight to De Lestosa. There was no end to the embarrassment caused by this incapable and crabbed officer, and had not Wellesley interfered, he would have done more mischief and lost half his guns. By August 11th the Allies were in line once more, and the next day Cuesta resigned, his place being taken by Eguia. In the enemy's camps the old discord broke out between Ney and Soult, and the several corps soon separated, one remaining at Plasencia and another at Talavera, while Ney went to Valladolid, beating Wilson on the way, and Victor joined the king. Napoleon in Austria was enraged at the whole series of operations. He condemned Soult's march on Plasencia and insisted fiercely that the corps in the north should have joined the king through Madrid and have operated in a mass, the only road to success, he said, in a country where lines of communication are insecure. He wrote thus to Clarke from Schönbrunn, August 15th. The plan of directing Marshal Soult on Plasencia is faulty and contrary to all rule. It has every inconvenience and no advantage. 1. The English army can pass the Tagus, support itself upon Badajoz, and from that moment has no fear of Marshal Soult. 2. It may beat both armies in detail. If, on the contrary, Soult and Mortier had moved on Madrid, they would have been there by the 30th, and the army, united by August 15th, could have given battle and conquered Spain and Portugal. Sir Arthur justified the foresight of Napoleon to the letter. He not only crossed the Tagus, but when the conduct of the Spanish junta could no longer be borne, their soldiers plundered his baggage and even fired on his foragers, while they withheld supplies and transport, he fell back to the neighbourhood of Badajoz, whence he had secure communications with Lisbon. His brother Lord Wellesley was now ambassador at Seville, but his great influence was exerted in vain. "I am worked like a galley slave," he writes, "and can effect nothing." And Sir Arthur, now Viscount Wellington and Baron d'Oro, surveying the whole position of affairs, and seeing into the heart of them as clearly as Napoleon, resolved to trust in future to his own resources, and hold fast by his great original idea of defending the peninsula in Portugal with his British troops and growing Portuguese army. The Seville junta gave him the title of Captain General, which he accepted, but with his marked disinterestedness, vindicating, as he had done before in Portugal, his brother Henry's words about his indifference to money, he refused the pay the rank conferred, just as later, when they gave him an estate, he paid the rents into the treasury during the war. At home the Portland government had been broken up, Canning and Castlereagh had fought a duel, the public mind was seething with rage over the Walcheren failure, which might have been a success, and the scandals affecting the Duke of York. Wellington, who did not escape the insults of faction and the wrath of ignorance, remained unmoved and unremittingly walked in the path of his duty, supported faithfully by Lord Liverpool, who succeeded Castlereagh as Minister of War. End of Section 8. Section 9 of Wellington by George Hooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 7. The Last Campaign in Portugal, Part 1. This autumn of 1809 may be regarded as the turning point in his career, for it was then that he resolved to create those lines of Torres Vedras, which proved such a bitter surprise to the French army. He went to Lisbon in the beginning of October and finally settled that important matter, and then travelled to Seville, where he conferred with his elder brother, then about to depart for England and accept office as Minister for Foreign Affairs. By the middle of November he was again in Badajoz, and a letter which he sent thence to Lord Liverpool shows how distinctly he foresaw the tempest against which the shelter of the lines was prepared. At the end of July, before he knew what had happened at Talavera, Napoleon from Schönbrunn directed Clarke to stop any movement upon Portugal, but to prepare for an expedition in the following February. Wellington did not know of this, nor was he aware that on October 7th, 1809, Napoleon, now at peace with Austria, though still in her capital, notified to his Minister of War that in December 100,000 men should be collected between Bayonne and Orleans, and that he himself would lead these vast reinforcements into Spain. With what object? A fortnight earlier, in the dispatch appointing Soult Major General of his army in Spain, he says, "The King having no experience in war, my intention is that until I arrive you should be responsible. I wish myself to enter Lisbon as soon as possible." How did Wellington look on the same situation? "The enemy ought to make the possession of Portugal their first object when their reinforcements will arrive in Spain," he wrote to Lord Liverpool, November 19th, penetrating Napoleon's design. "I do not think they will succeed with an army of 70 or even 80,000 men if they do not make their attack for 2 or 3 months, which I believe is now impossible. I conceive not only that they may, but that they will make the attack before they will subdue the north of Spain." It was to parry this foreseen onset that he created the lines of Torres Vedras, and managed to keep his great project secret, not only from the enemy, but from his own army. It was toward the end of his long sojourn on the Guadiana that the Spanish junta, against his advice, once more sent forward their soldiers to defeat. Areizaga's army was routed at Ocaña, and Del Parque was worsted at Alba de Tormes, and thus Andalusia was laid open to the French. Wellington held his ground as long as he deemed it prudent, but toward the end of November, when the Spanish authorities were bent on following their own course, and even trying to force him into a dependent position, he transferred his main body from the Guadiana to the Mondego, and left the trusty hill at Abrantes to watch the Tagus valley. Then followed the invasion of Andalusia by Joseph and Soult, and the speedy capture of everything up to the walls of Cadiz, which, saved by Albuquerque's rapid march, was now reinforced by British troops drawn from Wellington's army, troops he could ill spare, yet did spare, so ready was he to subordinate his own interest to the common cause. During the spring and summer of 1810, even his steadfast mind was most severely tried. Napoleon, bent on divorcing the faithful Josephine and obtaining a new wife from a royal house, he first asked for a Russian and next secured an Austrian archduchess, engrossed by the affairs of a stupendous empire which he was enlarging year by year, and involved already in an incipient quarrel with Russia, was unable to keep his word and conduct a second campaign in the Peninsula. But he poured tens of thousands of troops over the Pyrenees, urged on and lashed his marshals and generals, gave them almost absolute power within the limits of their commands, and not only made Soult military dictator in Joseph's realm, but appointed Massena, Prince of Essling, to command the army which was to conquer Portugal. Under Napoleon's vigorous stimulus, fortress after fortress fell in fighting Catalonia, and throughout Spain the French appeared to stride from victory to victory. One force flowing from the heart of the nation could not be repressed. The partidas and guerrillas, irregular warriors under irregular chiefs, were everywhere beaten and everywhere present. Hardly one single line of communication, though strongly guarded, was safe from incursions. Letters were intercepted, convoys captured, weak detachments beaten, and stragglers murdered. Nevertheless, the French in masses were always and easily victorious in the field, and as the strong places yielded, sometimes after a stout and sometimes after a feeble resistance, the Emperor's lieutenants appeared to have a grip of the country. In the midst of this tempest, Wellington and the armies he commanded were the only solid forces, erect, compact, and undaunted. The commander had not only to contend with an enemy led by redoubtable captains, he had to combat and control foes in the Portuguese regency, and sustain his own government. He had to withstand even the officers of his army, some highly placed, who helped the opposition, bombarded their friends at home with shrieks of despair, and rendered the House of Commons reluctant to vote supplies. The truth is, wrote Lord Liverpool in September 1810, the contest could never have been maintained in Portugal through the winter and spring if it had not been for the determination of the government to persevere in it at all risks to themselves, against not only the declared opinions of their opponents, but the private remonstrances of many of their friends. Nevertheless, the credit of tenacity is Wellington's due, for had he flinched, nothing could have averted a retreat from Portugal, perhaps from the Peninsula. Nor was it a blind tenacity, but one based on a sober and correct estimate of the facts. The superb qualities of his British troops, the weakness as well as the mighty strength of the French, Spanish folly and Spanish obstinacy, the steadfast and docile spirit of the Portuguese people, the disturbed condition of home politics which helped to enfeeble the government, not less than the natural defect which made the statesmen of all parties, and still more the parties themselves, incapable of taking profound and far-reaching views of any great military plans. He surveyed the whole field, so vast and so complex, formed just conclusions, and stood firmly by his judgment. But it was only after he had achieved splendid but still qualified successes that the greatness of his character was recognized and the confidence of the British people won. In the spring of 1810 the common cause seemed to be falling into ruin. No power in Europe except England was on foot against Napoleon, who was striving with all his might to exclude her from the continent and destroy her commerce. Wellington and his little army were in the north of Portugal, watching the storm gathering over the frontier. For Massena, having a wide command, had come to the front in May, intent on wresting Ciudad Rodrigo from the Spaniards in order to secure a solid base for the invasion of Portugal. He assembled more than 80,000 men, and had under his command nearly 40,000 more, for Renier on the Tagus and Bonnet on the Asturias were within his jurisdiction. When Ciudad was invested by Ney in June, the Spaniards and Portuguese eagerly besought Wellington to march to its relief. But an essential quality of a great commander is strength to resist temptation. He had that quality, and although it was hard to resist, it would have been weak to yield, since even success, always doubtful against superior numbers of good troops, would not have improved his position. He was threatened from the side of Estremadura as well as Castile, had to watch narrowly the movements on all sides, maintain a sharp contest with the obstructives in the Portuguese regency, and make up for the shortcomings of his government as well as he could. Nothing shook his constancy of mind. Ciudad Rodrigo surrendered early in July, yet he still held his ground. Before and during the siege, the famous Light Division, commanded by Robert Crawford, faced the French on the Agueda, and performed many actions which showed how perfect it was and how dangerous to assail. Wellington had expressly ordered Crawford not to fight beyond the Coa, the next deep affluent of the Douro on the plain. But Crawford did not obey. The fall of Ciudad still found him in front of the river, and when on July 24th Ney bounded forward at the head of 29,000 men, including a host of cavalry, the Light Division leader, carried away by his pugnacity, lingered to fight him, and it was a marvel that his hardy men escaped. But they did, thanks to their own great qualities, although the sole line of retreat was over a bridge at the bottom of a deep ravine, and when by luck and judgment they had crossed, no Frenchman or few followed, for the deadly musketry drew a line on the bridge which none could pass. "I am glad to see you safe, Crawford," said the general when he met him. "Oh, I was in no danger, I assure you," replied the fighting Scot. "But I was, from your conduct," said Wellington. Crawford's sole private comment was, "He is damned crusty today," and he had reason to be. The British lost 342 killed, wounded, and prisoners, but the French were fewer by 1,000 men. Then Almeida, which stands beyond the Coa, was invested. A lucky shell falling in the magazine paralyzed the defence, and the strong little fortress, which should have resisted for some weeks, surrendered. The two places which Massena needed for the security of his advance were thus in his power, and the long-deferred wrestle with the mighty French army was now to begin. Wellington still held his positions, and kept them until the arrival of Renier at Guarda. The gate into the line on the right made it clear that Massena was coming on. Then he began to retreat in accordance with his carefully prepared plan, and directed Hill and Leith, who were near Abrantes and Tomar, to join him in front of Coimbra, for he never intended to risk a battle so far from Lisbon, or fight at all unless on formidable ground. The disposition he had made of his divisions was framed for the purpose of guarding all the practicable lines of invasion, and concentrating upon that which the adversary might select. So that when, in the middle of September, the French Marshal started forward, Wellington yielded the ground he occupied in order to secure his retreat upon the lines. He watched his opponent closely, and was so quick that his troops were united on the Alva when the French were at Viseu, for Hill had detected the movement of Renier, and, anticipating orders, had marched at once towards his chief. Massena selected for his line of advance the right bank of the Mondego, said to be the worst road in Portugal, and when his masses of troops and baggage emerged from the defiles, he found himself between the river and a curving range of mountains, and on the mountains the allied army barring his way to Coimbra. The two armies had moved on each bank of the river, but the allies crossed to the right, where the stream breaks through the lofty heights, and occupied the position of Busaco on the ridge which closes the deep and wooded vales. Reduced since May by disease and combat to 56,000 men, the French were wedged in between the Mondego and the Caramula Sierra, with no outlet known to them except over the crest of the ridge where Wellington halted to fight a battle. That serious risk did not form part of his original design. He had induced the Regency to enforce the old laws exacting service from all able-bodied Portuguese, and besides the 30,000 regulars trained by Beresford, there were under arms in the hills from the Minho to the capes of Algarve, from the sea to the rugged frontier, many score thousands of men willing and eager, but badly armed and ill-fed, commanded by local leaders or partisan chiefs like Trant and John Wilson and Silveira. When the French moved southward, these swarmed on their flanks and rear, easily brushed away, yet ever returning. Wellington proposed, and the Regency agreed to act, on the stern, harsh, yet effective plan of wasting the whole country between the Estrella and the sea, and transporting the people who could not hide in the mountains into the lines, so that Massena, deprived of all sources of supply and having no magazines, because he acted on Napoleon's maxim that war should support war, would be forced to retreat when he was stopped before the fortified positions covering Lisbon. It was therefore not necessary to fight, and if the British general chose to do so, though he afterwards thought it a mistake, he did so deliberately, and because at the time he thought a battle would raise the confidence and gratify the yearnings of his troops, and give a certain splendour to his retreat. He could trust his greatly outnumbered British troops in a strong defensive position, and not doubting their goodwill, he could test the worth of Beresford's Portuguese in actual combat. It was a risk, because Leith and Hill were near, but not on the field, when the leading columns of the French appeared. But when he thought it right to run a risk, he was never the man to shirk the responsibility. And considering that the French armies had been so triumphant in Spain, it was just as well to remind them again, before getting beyond their reach behind works, that they were not invincible. Perhaps the risk was greater than he judged it to be, for when Ney and Regnier came in sight of the position, the allies were not in array, and Ney desired to begin a battle at once. But Massena was some miles distant. Ney dared not fight without leave, and before the French commander joined the Marshal, the opportunity, if any such really existed, had passed away. As they were closing on the Sierra, Wellington was obliged to take command of the light division, in order to prevent Crawford from plunging into action. Always burning to fight, he had waited so long that all the skill of the general, says Napier, and the readiness of the troops could scarcely evade a disaster. Luckily, the general was ubiquitous, which means that he saw where the pinch was likely to be. He was usually foremost in an advance, and with the hindmost in a retreat. When Massena, on the afternoon of the 26th, reconnoitred the position, he found it well occupied, yet he resolved to fight on the following day. The position of Busaco was a mountain crest 8 miles long, extending from the Mondego on the right to the impassable ridges of the Caramula Sierra on the left. The highest ground was in the centre, and there stood Spencer with the 1st Division. On his right were Picton, Leith, and Hill. Forward, yet below him, was Pack, and on his left front, upon a lower bastion like rocky spur, was the Light Division and a German brigade, while Cole held the extreme left, abutting on the pathless Caramula. 3 roads coming from Martagoa cut through the position, each running on to Coimbra, one passing a large convent in rear of the left centre, and a road also ran along the crest behind the front of battle. The French troops were on the opposing ridges, separated from Busaco by a chasm so profound that the naked eye could hardly distinguish the movement of troops in the bottom, yet in parts so narrow that 12-pounders could range across. Massena feared lest the British general should not wait the shock. The British general was confident of success if he were assailed, for Massena need not have fought. He might have turned the line before him. But while Wellington knew of the rough, narrow track from Martagoa through the Caramula to Boyalva, and hoped that it was guarded by Trent, who could not have resisted but only delayed an army, the French marshal was ignorant of the road, and even had its existence been reported to him, he would probably still have preferred a battle to a manoeuvre. Thus at dawn on September 27th, Regnier and Ney sent forward columns of attack. Junot, the marshal, held in reserve, and the Battle of Busaco began. The French made two determined onsets, widely separated and not simultaneous. Regnier's brigades, directed against the right, climbed the slopes with unflagging strides, and were first in action. Driving in Picton's skirmishers and their supports, they won the crest, and while one portion turned to the right, the other formed across the ridge facing the Mondego. Wellington himself brought up 2 guns, which opened on the flank of the former intruders with grape, while musketry struck their front. Finally, a resolute charge by the 88th and half the 45th swept them from the height and down the steep up which they had valiantly ascended. The other part of the column did not long retain its vantage ground. General Leith, who saw their progress up the hill, hastened forward with 1 brigade, and the 9th, under Colonel Cameron, running in without firing a shot, turned them out of the position, but did not pursue except with musketry. And Hill coming up as well as Leith's 2nd Brigade, the struggle was over, for Regnier was unable to resume the battle. On the other flank, Ney fared no better. His hardy soldiers also overcame the obstacles in their path until they had nearly gained the summit, but then the line once more mastered the column. Crawford, alone on a rock, waited until the French were close below the crest, following the retiring riflemen, and at the right moment he sent the 43rd and 42nd into the fray. Their fury could not be resisted, for their charge broke the head of the column, their fire struck both front and flanks, and 3 terrible discharges at 5 yards' distance shattered the wavering mass. Here again discipline prevailed, and the pursuit was stayed. These 2 severe combats virtually ended the battle, for afterwards no serious attack was made. The position had been assailed and found impregnable. The killed and wounded on the side of the Allies is put down at 1,300 men, while the French lost 1 general and 800 men killed and 3 generals wounded, their total loss being estimated at 4,500. It was a rude lesson. During the afternoon, for the battle ceased soon after midday, Massena took counsel, and learned accidentally that a rough road over the Caramula would enable him to turn the position. He resolved to take it at once. The next day, covered by skirmishing in the ravines, the French army disappeared from the right and were seen traversing the mountains on the left. Napier gives us a glimpse of his commander on the evening of the 28th. From the ground occupied by the Light Division, he looked at the distant columns with great earnestness. He seemed uneasy. His countenance bore a fierce, angry expression, and suddenly mounting his horse, he rode away without speaking. 1 hour afterwards, the whole army was in movement, heading by different routes for the lines. The fierce, angry expression may be referred to the failure of Trent, for which he was not to blame, to obstruct the narrow path to Boyalva. The army retired by easy marches toward Lisbon, and as Massena fondly hoped to embark in their ships and leave him master, but when he approached the mountains, the British army had vanished through the passes, and the French marshal stood baffled and astonished before the formidable works of an entrenched camp, which snatched from his grasp the fruits of the campaign. It was a surprise not only to the Prince of Essling, but to the Portuguese and the British army, and it may be said that the stupendous design realized in the secret and assiduous construction of the lines of Torres Vedras revealed for the first time to his countrymen, as well as to Europe, the military genius of England's great captain. Massena marched his troops boldly up to the verge of the fortified hills. He had declared that the position of Busaco was the strongest in Portugal. Here he found a stronger, and after a close examination of all he could see, he refrained from attack. But the line visible to him was only one of a series. Wellington and the engineer, Colonel Fletcher, had converted the heights flanked by the Tagus in the Atlantic into a fortress, and the general had formed his design, and the colonel had begun the work in October 1809 to meet the exigency which arose in October 1810. It was the cornerstone of the system whereby he undertook to defend Portugal, when he asked first for 30 and then for 35,000 British troops, the greatest number he could feed. There were 3 lines. The foremost extended from Alandra on the Tagus to the mouth of the Zizandre on the sea. That, though powerful, was not absolutely impervious to attack at the outset, but became so when the rains filled the streams and flooded the banks of the Zizandre. The second, which touched the meadows of the Tagus south of the Calendris and the ocean at the mouth of the San Lorenzo, was the real defence, and behind these 2 was the third on the estuary below Lisbon, drawn around the castle of San Julian, garrisoned by marines, and thrown up as cover for an embarkation, so that all emergencies, even the worst, were provided for. But Wellington never believed that the French would be able to drive him to his ships, and only feared lest the British government should recall his army. The whole stupendous array which barred all the roads through the mountains was well armed and amply manned by a victorious army, while every day the mighty strength of the original works was increased by the energy and invention of the defenders. Massena judged rightly when he stood aloof and took post between Villafranca and Sobral, until dire necessity obliged him to retire upon Santarém, and also to permit his veterans to spread themselves abroad in search of food, and thus ruin their fine discipline. The Marshal held on to the Tagus and the Zezere, partly because he got some provand from that unwasted country, and also because he still hoped that Soult or Mortier from the south would join him. Wellington had called Romana and 6,000 Spaniards into the lines. They crossed the Tagus at Aldea Gallega, opposite Lisbon, and Napoleon declared that Soult ought to have followed them, as if that would have been practicable in itself, or in the conditions governing the proceedings of Soult. But Napoleon was not well informed, and he had got into the habit of demanding too much from his generals. The truth is that in the winter of 1810 and 11, while Massena was cut off from communication even with his magazines, Soult could neither take Cadiz nor detach sufficient troops from Andalusia to relieve the army of Portugal. Coimbra, with a host of wounded, had been captured by Trent almost before the French were on the Tagus, and Silveira, taking post in the mountains, had turned back Gardan with supplies from Ciudad Rodrigo. Wellington, secure behind his rocks and redoubts, ready to spring forward so soon as his foe retreated, was still in danger from his friends and allies. Certain members of the Regency opposed and harassed him until he could only free himself by threatening to withdraw, and when that did not avail, changing the governing body in self-defence. It was the arrogant faction which had failed to devastate the country, thus leaving resources within reach of the French, and it was the same men who starved their own people and soldiers and strove to inflame the populace of Lisbon against their defenders. In addition to the folly of the Portuguese, he had to wrestle with the political weakness of his own government, growing out of causes which seemed inherent in the British system. Even in January 1811 he wrote to Mr. William Pole that the only instructions he had were to save the British army, and that is the only object, he said, officially stated to me for keeping an army in the peninsula. But privately the object was plainly declared. He had, he said, scarcely the force, 35,000 infantry, originally promised. He wanted more troops and more money, and his remarks that if we cannot persevere in carrying it, the contest, on in the peninsula or elsewhere on the continent, we must prepare to make one of our own islands the seat of war. If he were largely reinforced, he was tolerably certain of the result, and he added, "I am equally certain that if Bonaparte cannot root us out of this country, he must alter his system in Europe, and give us such a peace as we ought to accept." At the same time he doubted whether the administration had the power, inclination, or nerve to do what should be done. They allowed him no patronage or power, such as a commander always had, and though he was the mainspring of all other operations, yet they gave him neither influence nor support nor means of acquiring influence. "I have not authority to give a shilling or a stand of arms or a round of ammunition to anybody. I do give all, it is true, but it is contrary to my instructions and at my own peril." Not another officer in the army would even look at the risks he incurred every day, but if he did not incur them, the contest would not go on for a moment. These warm words paint the situation in strong colours, and they show that Wellington was the soul of the war in the peninsula. Reinforcements were on the way, and also notes of discouragement still went out from his officers and came from London. Yet he remained firm and constant, and literally saved the government and the country he served by his strength of mind and unswerving fidelity. Such was his duty as a servant of the state, and his duty he always performed. At that very moment the Spaniards on the Guadiana, neglecting to destroy or defend the bridge at Merida, had allowed the French to threaten the Alentejo, that is, the approach to the left bank of the Tagus opposite Lisbon, and had thus increased the necessity of guarding the headlands on the harbour. Soult, indeed, was now seriously bent on capturing Olivenza, Badajoz, and Elvas before cooperating with Massena. He took the first, but ere Badajoz surrendered on March 11th, Massena had been 4 days on the road to northern Spain, and as Graham defeated Victor at Barossa on the 5th, Soult gained nothing except Badajoz, which was much, for he was obliged to hurry back to guard Andalusia. The enemy had lingered long in the valley of the Tagus, and had offered no opening for attack. "Massena is an old fox," Wellington writes from Cartago. After the retreat of the French to Santarém, "he risks nothing." So it was, but at length, when no news came from Soult, and no reinforcements except a few thousands under Drouet, who did not pass Leiria, and failed to open the line of communication, when disease and want had reduced his army to some 50,000 men, the old Marshal resolved to retreat. He began his stealthy movement on the 2nd day of March, with the baggage and Ney's corps, but Junot and Regnier did not slip away until the evening of the 5th, and the whole movement was so cleverly managed that Wellington was not able to follow in force until the 7th. But the light division was off in pursuit early on the 6th, and soon the whole army was on the track of the French. From that time it was a race for positions and lines of retreat. But although Massena desired to seize Coimbra and secure the high road to Oporto and the line of the Douro, his object was frustrated, partly by the failures of his subordinates and greatly by the vigour of the pursuit. Regnier had retreated from the road from Tomar to Espinal, while Ney and Junot took the mountain paths towards Pombal. The former was followed by one brigade and some horse, the latter by the main army. Leith and Picton advancing from the lines of Leiria along the road to Coimbra, the others over the hills from Santarém and Tomar. Massena halted his 2 corps at Pombal, still uncertain whether Trant could be frightened out of Coimbra, and on the 10th the Allies were up in his front. An attempt at resistance was speedily overcome, and the French fell back toward Condeixa. Ney, however, hard pressed, stopped to fight or gain time at Radinia, on a plain commanding the hollow through which ran the high road, flanked by a pine wood and the Sierra. Wellington, who was early on the ground, reconnoitred the position, but Ney had made so fine a display that his force seemed larger than it was. Therefore Wellington sent the light division on one flank and Picton on the other, and drew up his main body against the centre. A contemporary letter from a gallant gunner engaged in the fight says, "Figure to yourself 14,000 men with their colours unfurled, advancing in line, and supported by solid columns of infantry and cavalry on their flanks, and a second line in rear of the centre. Indeed, it was such a sight that all former military spectacles must give way to." Still, for once, Wellington had been imposed on, for, according to Napier, there were already on the ground enough troops to overwhelm Ney, and when the gorgeous lines started forward, the enemy had vanished over the river Sour, and could only be struck by the artillery. That was to the credit of Ney as a master of tactics, but he ran a great risk and was taught a useful lesson. From Radinia the pursuit followed fast through Condeixa. Massena, it is true, halted again behind that town, yet only to cover his line of retreat and outface his adversary. Wellington then assumed a masterful initiative and turned the French left with the 3rd Division, whereupon Ney burned Condeixa, and the enemy retreated in some confusion toward Marsella, where a bridge spanned the Alva just above its confluence with the Mondego, the sole road open. Ney, who had all the fighting, stood fast at Castelnavel, until, being assailed in front and turned on his left, he was forced to give ground, and the left bank of the Sierra being the higher, he thought it desirable to hold it, and with some 6,000 men faced his pursuers at Fonch d'Arose, with a river in his rear. There he waited too long, for Wellington, knowing his audacious temper, closed with him at once, inflicted great losses on one wing of his gallant troops, and obliged him to cross the Seria in the night. This was on the 15th, a week since the pursuit began, during which time Massena allowed no rest, had been driven from every position, thrust aside from Coimbra, and compelled to take the road to Ciudad Rodrigo, and he would have suffered still more severely had not Wellington's plans been frustrated by the heedlessness of some of his subordinates. The French corps were now again united, for Regnier had come up, and the British brigade which had followed him also joined the main body. Massena, having broken the bridges, made one more attempt to stand behind the Alva, and seemed confident in his position. Yet he was speedily shaken and again in retreat when he saw the British soldiers traversing the rugged heights on his left, and less than 3 weeks after he began his clever movements from Santarém, he was in Celorico, the point from which he launched his invading columns down the Mondego in September 1810. He now wished to transfer his army through Guarda to Coria on the Alagon, and threaten Lisbon from the side of the Tagus. Ney openly disobeyed his orders. The Marshal thereupon sent him back to France, gave the Sixth Corps to Loison, and moved to Guarda, where he joined Regnier. He hoped to remain there, but Wellington, whose reinforcements had arrived at the front and filled up the gap made by the march of Cole's division to join Beresford on the left bank of the Tagus, closed upon Guarda, and on the 29th tumbled the French out of that strong position, compelling them to retreat beyond the Coa and occupy Sambugal. Massena still clung to the idea of conquering Portugal, and continued his duel with Wellington to the last. End of Section 9. Section 10 of Wellington by George Hooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 7. The Last Campaign in Portugal, Part 2. Fortune did not smile on him, and on April 3rd Wellington enveloped and defeated Regnier, who held Sabugal, and the next day the whole invading army crossed the frontier into Spain. This last engagement, which brought out once more the fine qualities of the Light Division, was marred of its full impact by accidents, but the principal events in that astonishing fight will always shed a glory on the names of Sidney Beckwith, Captain John Hopkins, and the officers and men of the Light Division and their comrades, elders Portuguese caçadores, whose skill, valour, and tenacity received the high reward of Wellington's public and unqualified praise. 4 days afterwards, Massena, leaving a division at Ciudad Rodrigo, retired upon Salamanca, having lost every battle and combat and 30,000 men in the campaign. Wellington then invested Almeida and took up once more the line of the Águeda over against the great frontier fortress. Well might Lord Liverpool, while publicly expressing the pride and pleasure of his government, say in a private letter to Wellington, "The retreat of the French certainly forms a new era in the war." The event, he adds, has fully confirmed all your predictions, adding that the government was determined not to be diverted from the Peninsula to other objects. His difficulties as to finance and specie were great, but instead of recalling troops, a regiment of horse which he asked for was sent out, and the government, which a few weeks earlier had refused to allow him to accept the command of the Spanish armies, now recovered sufficient courage to ask for the great commander's opinion respecting what could be done in the interior of Spain. The letters, dated April 11th, mark the period of change from apprehension to confidence. That was something gained, yet Wellington's position was still more embarrassing because the Portuguese authorities were neglectful, if not treacherous, and because the French had made such progress in Estremadura, capturing Olivenza, Badajoz, and Campo Mayor. When it was certain that Massena must retire, Beresford was reinforced and sent toward the Guadiana with 2 divisions to oust Mortier and recover the fortresses. By rapid marches he did succeed in snatching back first Campo Mayor and then Olivenza, but was not equally happy in dealing with Badajoz. Although the breaches were still open, at the beginning of April Wellington started from the front on the Águeda to try what he could do in the south, leaving Sir Brent Spencer in command. He was near Badajoz in Beresford's camp on April 21st and did what was possible, which was not much, to rally the Spaniards and remedy errors. And in the midst of his exertions came the startling and unexpected intelligence that Massena was once more near Ciudad Rodrigo and bent on raising the blockade of Almeida. Wellington instantly hurried to his northern army, moving with such expedition that he rejoined it on April 28th. "It was lucky," he writes, "that I came when I did." Massena had obtained the reluctant aid of Bessieres, who commanded in Castile, and was resolved to make one more throw for victory. He did not know it, but Napoleon had already transferred the command of the army of Portugal to Marmont, nor did he know that he was starting to fight his last battle. When the French became threatening, the British divisions were collected about Fuentes d'Anoro, a village on the Duas Casas, a torrent running in a deep ravine parallel to the Turones and the Coa, on the right bank of which stream stood the beleaguered Almeida. Massena brought up on May 2nd 4 corps d'armée and the horse lent by Bessieres. He had perhaps more than 40,000 men, including a force of cavalry far superior to that of the Allies, and he was the assailant, for Wellington fought a defensive battle. The position he held, although it had some advantages, was not a good one. Its strength lay in the deep trench of the Duas Casas and the rocky elevations which extended from that torrent back to the Turones. Its weakness was the easily accessible plain on the right, below the ridge of rough ground, over which the enemy might strive to force his way and gain the line of retreat upon the bridge spanning the Coa at Castellobom. The left was secured by the 5th Division on the road to Almeida, and the 6th opposite the village of Almeida. The 1st and 3rd were in and near Fuentes, while the 7th, together with the Spanish cavalry of Julian Sanchez, was advanced into the plain on the right. The Light Division was held in reserve. The fight began on the 3rd with an attack by Loison upon Fuentes, into which he penetrated, but from which he was expelled after a sharp combat and driven over the stream. The next day Massena and Bessieres examined the position, and the armies were quiet. On the 5th a tempest broke. One corps skirmished on the left of the British line, and Fuentes was again the scene of a fierce encounter which raged in the village street and about the chapel on the summit. But the main attack was made upon the right, where the divisions of the French 6th Corps, supported by the whole of their numerous cavalry, except the horsemen of the Imperial Guard, crossed the Duas Casas and burst through the wood into the plain. Julian Sanchez was driven or retired over the Turones. The British cavalry, outnumbered, remained to support the infantry, which was also obliged to fall back, and Norman Ramsay saved his battery by charging right through the French horse. At the earliest indication of the formidable onset, Wellington had sent forward the light division to sustain the 7th, and both were thrown into squares, yet not before some men of the latter were slain, though no square was broken. Then the light division, once more under Crawford, covered the retreat of the 7th over the Turones, and, always attended by the faithful British horse, withdrew majestically in their compact formation back toward the heights, defying the swarms of French cavalry, who danced about them yet dared not charge. It is admitted that the moment was one full of peril, and the French contend that had Loison pushed on with a will, they must have won. They also say that he dared not take upon himself to act without orders, and that the 4 divisions and all the cavalry, by an inconceivable fatality, suddenly stopped short, just as they should have gathered the fruit of victory. Perhaps the stout bearing and steady movement of the light division had some effect, but in any case the French did not strike, and the British general got out of his difficulty by forming a new front of battle. The rest of the combat was confined to a cannonade and a contest for the village, where the adversaries with varying fortune fought all day, but the higher portion was never relinquished, and at night the French withdrew over the river. The French admit a loss of 2,000 killed and wounded. That of the British was 1,500, including 300 prisoners. The possession of Almeida was secured by the battle, but Brenier, who commanded there, burst many guns, exploded mines in the bastions, and sallying forth carried safely through the investing force 4/5 of his garrison of 1,500 men. This fine success of the Frenchmen drew from Wellington the caustic remark in a private letter that he began to be of opinion that there is nothing on earth so stupid as a gallant officer. They were all sleeping in their spurs even, but the French got off. Publicly he put a severe rebuke on carelessness and over-confidence into a general order. Massena, after his repulse, did not remain long on the Duas Casas, and on the 10th the French were again over the Agueda, where the war-worn veteran gave over the command to Marmont, who moved the army to Salamanca. Wellington, having shaken off the army of Portugal for the 3rd time, turned his eyes again toward the south. He was still near Almeida when news came from Beresford that Soult was moving to succour Badajoz, and before either he or the troops he had detached from the Beira could reach the Guadiana, the terrible battle of Albuera had been fought and won by a grand display of disciplined courage. Yet so hard was the task that at the end 1,800 unwounded men, the remnant of 6,000 unconquerable British soldiers, stood triumphant on the fatal hill. When Wellington arrived, Soult had drawn back to Llerena in the mountains, where in the middle of June he was joined by Drouet. From that post he watched the siege of Badajoz, Wellington's first serious attempt to recover the fortress, not according to the rules of art, for he had not the means, but by rougher measures, since he had to win or lose in a given time with the few and imperfect resources at his command. Brialmont, a competent judge, condemns all Wellington's sieges from an artistic point of view, but he cannot help admiring them as examples of what courage and perseverance can effect when opposed by adverse fortune and the vices of a backward military organization. In this first effort to take Badajoz he failed. Napoleon had ordered Marmont to join Soult, and as the former went south from Salamanca, Spencer, quitting Weir, took the same direction, and each arrived on the scene about the same time. Wellington therefore raised the siege and occupied a position behind the Caya, for the two marshals had 64,000 men, and his force barely exceeded 2/3 of that number. For some reason they did not attack, perhaps because ces vieux guerriers, toujours vainqueurs dans le Nord, et si souvent en Espagne, n'abordèrent plus les Anglais qu'avec une certaine défiance. Or, as Napier puts it, Marmont's army was conscious of recent defeats at Busaco, Sabugal, and Fuentes d'Onoro. The horrid field of Albuera was fresh. The fierce blood there spilled still reeked in the nostrils of Soult's soldiers. And thus the bold bearing of Wellington, assumed at great risk to impose on the enemy, had an ally in the chastened temper of his once confident foes. The sum and substance of this great effort of concentration by the French was the relief of Badajoz. The two marshals, who could not risk a battle, soon separated again, because Wellington, having induced Blake to enter Andalusia, and having set other Spanish generals in motion, Soult was obliged to hurry to the rescue of Seville and Granada, and Marmont did not feel strong enough to stand alone. King Joseph also added to the trouble by going suddenly to Paris, declaring he would abdicate. Napoleon made concessions to pacify him, and gave him more money and sent more troops, including part of the Imperial Guard, through the Pyrenees. Yet although he publicly admitted that the combat with England would be fought thenceforth in Spain, and still spoke of going thither himself, he was at that instant considering a descent on Ireland, forming schemes for the invasion of England from Antwerp, Boulogne, and Cherbourg, and preparing on all sides for the rapidly approaching war with Russia, which Wellington scented in the wind. At this moment, when his position was full of peril, when the French had not only captured the eastern fortresses, but, what concerned him more nearly, held Badajoz and Ciudad Rodrigo, leaving Elvas alone as a support in the south and nothing in the north, when Spanish resistance was at its lowest ebb and almost confined to the irrepressible guerillas, when the Portuguese native authorities were all but openly hostile and quite openly obstructive, the steadfast captain kept a constant mind. He had hours of doubt and righteous wrath when the mighty burden pressed upon him, and he talked of retiring from the turmoil. But that supreme sense of duty, his greatest quality, soon prevailed, and as he manfully confronted, so he overcame his thronging troubles. From the pestilential Guadiana the war shifted once more toward the north, and after a series of adroit manoeuvres, Wellington and Marmont were on the frontiers of Castile. The English general cherished the design of wresting Ciudad Rodrigo from his foe, and in August he caused a battering train sent from England to be landed at Oporto secretly and dragged over the mountains to the valley of the Agueda. At one moment it seemed possible that the fortress might be blockaded and surprised when scantily supplied with food, but that moment passed, the French being too quick and the convoys too well guarded. Yet Wellington remained close by, watching for a chance, and Marmont was equally on the alert to frustrate his adversary. He had great means, for he could call up large forces, and was daring as well as capable. In point of numbers the opponents were not fairly matched, as Wellington could only dispose of some 44,000 men. While vigilant on the Agueda, Wellington, always provident, repaired the famous lines on both banks of the Tagus, and vainly endeavoured to make the Regency improve the roads and bridges in his rear, moved thereto by the menaced advent of Napoleon. In September Marmont, called on to throw fresh stores into Ciudad, collected 60,000 men at Tamanes on the 21st, and not only poured abundant supplies into the fortress, but dashed in among the British divisions, which were widely separated, yet not so posted that they could not unite if time were gained. It was gained, for Wellington, with a weak force, daringly resisted an attack by a mass of cavalry at El Bodon, and when the 77th and 5th regiments were obliged to retreat, They did so in one square, defying and punishing the swarming horsemen, and falling back slowly towards Guinaldo, after being joined by other regiments of the 3rd Division. At Guinaldo a few redoubts formed a sort of entrenched post, and in the afternoon it was occupied by about 14,000 men. Later came in 2 regiments which had been thrust off the direct route, and the Light Division was still absent. After devious wanderings, apparently caused by Crawford's preference for his own line of retreat, and when Marmont had assembled an immense force on the British front, the Light Division arrived, fatigued but entire. Wellington then drew in all his divisions and concentrated them upon a position behind the stream of Villamayor. The French Marshal attacked the outposts at Aldea Ponte, but pushed his advantages no further, and let slip the fairest chance he ever had of beating Wellington. The latter retired to even a stronger position in a loop of the Coa, and was not molested or followed. Nothing beyond brilliant combats resulted from these formidable-looking French operations, and it is easy to see that Wellington owed his safety to his coolness in danger, the intrepidity of his troops, and to the moral ascendancy which he had established over the minds of his adversaries by his uniform success in baffling their manoeuvres and defeating their armies. The French returned to their old quarters at Salamanca, and in the valley of the Tagus the British troops were quiet for months, distributed in cantonments over a wide area, and Wellington, busy as he always was, found time occasionally to hunt with Lord Tweeddale's imported pack of foxhounds, giving out, to mislead the French, that he would have 2 packs next year. During this period of inaction, the main design cherished by the Commander-in-Chief was the recovery of Ciudad Rodrigo. To that object he bent all his energies, and kept his secret so well that none guessed it down to the moment of execution. He brought up the battering train to Almeida, which revealed nothing, as the guns were apparently obtained to arm the fortress. He kept his division spread out for the sake of subsistence, and that looked like weakness. He constructed a bridge to be used on the Agueda, and accumulated other means, but the purpose was never conjectured. The boldness of the project was favourable to success, since the French did not think that in the depth of winter he would venture on any large and hazardous enterprise. So, keeping his own counsel, he prepared and watched for a fitting opportunity. It came at the end of the year. Napoleon, drawing away the Imperial Guard and all the Poles, rearranged his armies in Spain in December, giving, as he said, 42 in lieu of the 36 battalions which he abstracted, but the quantity did not make up for the quality, and he took no account of the horse. Moreover, he wanted Marmont not only to counteract Wellington, but also to reinforce Suchet, and he seemed to draw a line between the operations of Marmont and Soult, tending to deepen the existing jealousies which the feeble Joseph was not competent to soothe or dispel. Wellington, taking advantage of the transition or confusion, reaped the fruit of his own astute line of conduct, which had bewildered one marshal, and Hill's intelligent energy, which had upset the calculations of another. When least expected, he swooped down upon Ciudad Rodrigo, and was master of its defences before Marmont could collect an army of relief. Success depended on rapidity, and rapidity meant a great loss of life, but in no other way could the place be captured under the conditions, and the sacrifice brought more solid gain than if it had occurred in battle. With all his propelling power, Wellington could not begin the siege until January 8, 1812, when, by a daring stroke, Colborne stormed the exterior redoubt on a hill called the Great Tesson, and established the first parallel. The working parties were hindered by the severe weather and the want of transport, as well as by the enemy's fire, but by the 13th 28 guns were in the batteries, and on the afternoon of the 14th they opened fire at long range. In order to anticipate the coming of a relieving army, it was resolved to effect a breach or breaches, and storm in at once without blowing in the counterscarp. The operation was aided by the capture of 2 convents outside the body of the place, and the approaches were pushed forward to the Lesser Tesson. Despite a destructive defence, 10 days after the first shot was fired, the breaches were declared to be practicable, and the next day the storming columns were in action. The principal resistance was at the great breach, where the conflict was deadly, but through the lesser breach the light division regiments forced an entrance, and thus turned the position of the defenders, so that the 3rd Division also broke in. On all sides the storming parties were victorious. The town filled rapidly with soldiers, and the governor, retreating to the castle with a great part of the garrison, soon surrendered. It was a brilliant example of resolute valour, but the price of victory was great. The Allies lost 1,200 men and 90 officers killed and wounded, 1/2 in the breaches, the list including Crawford and Mackinnon, who were slain, and Vandeleur and Colborne, who were wounded. The fruits of that day were 1,500 prisoners, large stores of ammunition, and 150 guns, among which was Marmont's battering train. But the greatest prize was the fortress itself, which, constituting a barrier to the invasion of Portugal, opened a road into Spain. The British made their triumphant general an earl, the Spaniards Duke of Ciudad Rodrigo, and the Portuguese Marquis of Torres Vedras. The capture of Ciudad marked a new stage of the war. One measure of his merit is the consternation of his adversaries. Marmont, who only heard of the siege on the 15th, assembled 45,000 men at Salamanca on January 25th, nearly a week after the fortress had succumbed. When learning the fact, he withdrew to Valladolid. It was not until the 27th that Napoleon got news of an English movement on Ciudad Rodrigo, which he thought was undertaken as a diversion to aid Valencia, then besieged by Suchet, and he instantly authorized a temporary detention of the Imperial Guard as a support for Marmont. Learning that Ciudad had fallen, he insisted that the Marshal, if he could not retake it, should occupy Salamanca and make an incursion into Portugal in order to detain Wellington in Weir. A little later, February 18th, he reiterated his orders at great length, directing Marmont to keep his troops together, so that if Wellington committed the great fault of moving on Badajoz, the Marshal from Salamanca might bring him swiftly back by moving on Almeida. Before that advice reached Marmont, Wellington had committed the fault, and his northern opponent was not in a position to do anything that would arrest or punish his audacious enterprise, audacious yet based on a cool estimate of the facts, and no heedless spring upon a tempting prey. It is a remarkable fact that the preparations for the recapture of Badajoz were in progress before the siege of Ciudad was begun. Success in the latter case depended more on the disposition of the hostile armies, in the former on climatic considerations. In both, to a great extent, on the French belief that Wellington was a timid general who would not incur great risks. Yet had they studied his career, they would have known that few surpassed him in boldness, still fewer in far-reaching plans, and none then living in accomplishing much with small means. He took Ciudad in the depth of winter. He fell upon Badajoz in the spring, because he relied on the annual rains to fill the torrents and the streams which crossed the great road into Portugal, on the Portuguese militia and irregular troops to obstruct the passes, and most on his superior quickness and the valour of his troops, who trusted him as he trusted them. In addition, the Spanish bands and regulars were set in motion to harass Soult, and were lying in wait to dash on Seville and Granada if he moved upon the Guadiana. Therefore he transferred his army from Beira early in March, and on the 16th began his hard task, all the harder because Philippon, the governor of Badajoz, was an able warrior, and his ample garrison brave men. Covering the siege operations with an army in the field under Hill and Graham, he employed at first the 3rd, 4th, and light divisions, not much more than 3 times the strength of the garrison, and later the 5th, to win this great fortress, and he won it in 21 days. "The soldiers swear we shall succeed," he wrote on the 20th, "because we invested on St. Patrick's Eve and broke ground on St. Patrick's Day. And next to the inflexible resolution of the general, it was the officers and soldiers who mastered Badajos. For defective resources and imperative political reasons again set aside the rules of art, few of which could be obeyed. By sustained efforts 3 breaches were made, yet the approaches were so difficult that neither could be attacked by a compact formation nor stormed, even by the fiery, intrepid men who, on the night of April 6th, sacrificed themselves in hundreds rather than recede. They struggled for hours against the terrible obstacles, and just when the awful slaughter, with no result, made Wellington order the recall of these obstinate heroes, he learned that Picton's division had carried the castle by escalade, itself an enterprise of splendid daring, that the 5th Division had mastered the bastion of St. Vincent, and that the stronghold was practically his own. Then the other troops poured in, and Philippon, driven for refuge to San Cristobal, surrendered with all his men. The siege had cost the assailants more than 5,000 killed and wounded, the greater moiety during the conflict on that terrible night. And none who knew how tender was the heart of the great captain will be astonished to learn that the dread total moved him to a passion of tears. Pity it is that the victorious soldiers stained their fame by committing outrages hardly yet forgotten, that they heeded not his orders, and that they turned their bayonets on the general himself when he sought to restore discipline. The capture of Badajos, following so close on that of Ciudad Rodrigo, was a great blow to the French. The mere wind of the siege brought Soult through the mountains, but when he heard that the place had fallen and that the Spanish generals were moving on Seville, he hurried back to Andalusia. Wellington had designed a mighty stroke in that quarter which could not be delivered because Marmont took the field at the end of March, threatened Ciudad, and crossed the Coa, finally turning upon Sabugal and Castillo Branco. Wellington, therefore, passing the Tagus, obliged the French to retreat without effecting more than the partial dispersion of the Portuguese militia, and in April of 1812 the adversaries faced each other on the old ground. The Spaniards having neglected to repair and provision Ciudad, the army was obliged to bring up stores and remedy the defects. If the 2 marshals had not worked in harmony during this vigorous campaign, the failure was partially due to the profound and well-meant counsels of Napoleon. For Marmont could not act on his own judgment in defiance of orders for which he waited, and when they arrived it was too late. While Soult was vexed because the aid he looked for from his colleagues did not come. Wellington ably profited by these errors, increasing their effects by the impulse which he imparted to the Spanish bands from Ferrol to Alicante. For all the operations were interdependent, and remote successes as well as defeats told on the fortunes of the Anglo-Portuguese army, which was always the mainstay of the great contest. End of Section 10.